Hello, and welcome to the Loins of History podcast. I'm your host, Colin, and I'm joined by my co-host, Jay. Today, we've got a great episode on the Great Depression and the causes behind it. For a little bit of context behind the Great Depression, I wanted to talk about a few historical events that happened right before the Great Depression. So, in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was passed that created the Federal Reserve and a strong central bank. If you remember, in some of our earlier episodes, we talked about the ongoing conflict between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists about a central bank, and how it was championed by Alexander Hamilton, but absolutely fought against by Andrew Jackson. Then there was World War I from 1914 to 1918, with the U.S. entering late in 1917. There was the Spanish flu, which killed nearly 50 million people from about 1917 to about 1920. So a few years there, very similar to COVID. And then there was the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. That was finally passed in 1920. And the election of Harding and Coolidge in the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, which was seen as widespread economic boom for the United States and an increase in consumerism. So everything was going great in the 1920s. It was very business friendly. But then the Great Depression happened. So Jay, can you tell me some of the causes and what happened in 1929?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, the roadmap for this episode is we're just going to talk about what happened, and then we're going to talk about the two main explanations for why the Great Depression occurred. You know, here at the Loins of History, we're all about connecting history to current events. And it's kind of funny that we run in our series on capitalism and socialism, kind of makes sense that we'd be talking about the Great Depression in a time of economic uncertainty.
Everybody's talking about another depression or recession coming on right now. And there's a lot of fears about it. We've had two quarters of negative GDP growth.
Yeah. Well, we're already in a recession.
Not if you look at Wikipedia, the definition's changed.
Yeah. Well, that seems to be happening a lot these days. But yes, we've already had two fiscal quarters of negative growth, i.e., the economy hasn't grown, it's actually shrunk slightly, but it's the fact that it shrunk for two consecutive quarters, that's a recession. And I don't know if many of our listeners are on Twitter, but Twitter is full of doom and gloom these days.
Oh, yeah. I follow a lot of the former meme stalkers, and they are probably the most negative people out there, probably because they lost a lot of money in this past year. But
well,
there's a lot of
doom and
signs
gloom
out there.
gets followers.
That's true. It seems to be a recurring theme. But it is really interesting that you say that, because there is so much, like right now, just the pulse and the social media aspect of it. People are making connections and already assuming that there's another Great Depression 2.0. And looking at this and studying, it seems like there are some trends and some things that are very similar to what happened. Obviously, it was in the 20s, so yeah, just with the difference in technology and where we're at as an economy, there's some major differences, but it's very similar as well, I think. And it's right. That's why it's important to understand the context, so you can see the signs, and maybe we can figure out some policy and how to insulate ourselves against this.
Right. And I'm willing to bet that the majority of our listeners who are educated here in the United States, and I would be super interested for our non-U.S. listeners, how they were taught about how the Great Depression occurred. But the prevailing narrative, regardless of the technical explanation that one receives, the prevailing narrative is that capitalism was running amok. And in the 20s, it was this time of opulent luxury and irresponsibility. And then it all came crashing down in 1929. It all caught up with the dirty capitalists, and the people suffered. That's kind of the prevailing narrative, is that the dirty capitalists were, irresponsible, running amok in the 20s, and it all came crashing down in the stock market crash in 1929. That narrative isn't true. I hate to say it, but there's a reason why that narrative is in there. Now, that narrative, it's not a new thing. So to prevent the conspiracy theorists from also running amok. It's, if you've been following along on our history of socialism, like socialism is rapidly gaining ground in the United States ever since the late 1800s.
It's interesting in this period, from just doing some research on it, post World War One, the socialist movement was gaining ground, but a lot of it started to morph into a communist movement, especially amongst laborers. So there was, even during this time of opulence, that, so to speak, there were a lot of worker strikes and a lot of professed communists in the Communist Party leading that movement. And it almost seems like the socialists were kind of like, whoa, maybe calm down. We're going to negotiate this strike out. And a lot of the communists were much more extreme in their methods of striking. So there's some in Seattle. I mean, they're all over the country, in the Southeast, in textile mills, in Seattle. There was a really big one in 1919. I just think it's interesting that it's become this communist movement as well. And like you said before in a previous episode, all communists are socialists, but not all socialists are communists. It's a very specific definition behind communism. But, and then there's a quote by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically noticed that there was this growing unease amongst the working and lower class during the 1920s. He noticed that there was a lot of violence that occurred that was seemed foreign to him in these major cities. So even though on the surface, a lot of wealthy people were doing well, in the streets of New York and in the slums, he noticed things that just almost seemed inhuman to him. So I didn't really paraphrase his quote, or I guess I did, but that's basically one of the observations he made. And I thought that was really interesting, like leading up to this, that there was kind of these distant signs that not all was well. And it wasn't necessarily capitalism. There was just some growing problems beneath the surface.
Okay, let's dive in to just some key events. This is not going to be a crazy detailed explanation of a play-by-play of the Great Depression, but there's some key events that are helpful for us to understand. So the first one is the stock market crash in 1929. So in October of 1929, there was this speculative investment bubble. Stocks were inflated, similar to other bubbles like the dot-com bubble in the 90s, the real estate bubble in the late 2000s. Just stocks in general were inflated due to speculative investing. And essentially the bubble just popped. Now, why the bubble popped is still under significant debate. And we're just for the sake of time, we're not going to go too deep into that, because we want to focus on just why the Great Depression, which was from 1929 through, arguably some point in the middle of World War II in the 40s, why that 10 plus year period occurred, not this specific event in 1929, but there was a bubble and it popped, and stocks plummeted in October, and that had a lot of far-reaching implications, specifically for private investment in businesses. So when all this investment just kind of poof or goes poof, there's that money just is gone. It evaporates. And therefore, people were not investing a whole lot of money. Well, when the money goes poof, people get scared. And this is where one of the key themes of why the Great Depression occurred is fear and panic. And it's these emotional concerns start spreading and driving people to act in negative ways towards the economy.
It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like it's this pattern of reinforcement. It's like, oh man, it's going down. I better go get my money out. It goes down further. So it just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And just to connect the dots to today, during the, if obviously in like March of 2020 with COVID and the lockdowns, like the stock market plunged. But it plunged, and then they started giving out a lot of money and stimulus checks. So people began investing, and we want to talk about like highly speculative. Look at the tech stocks from 2020 through 2021. They just boomed. And then all of a sudden, if you've paid attention over the past 6 months, they have been going down dramatically. Same with crypto. People started pouring money in, and then they started getting kind of nervous and spooked and started taking money out very quickly. And right now people, say like, oh, I lost all this money in the stock market. It went away. It's because they invested and people started taking money out, and suddenly the wealth that they had created evaporates. Almost, it can happen overnight. And people started borrowing and investing on margin, which was another reason the stock market in the 20s crashed.
Yeah, so stocks are speculation. So there's two different ways to determine the value of a business. So business's stock, let's just take Apple, for example. Apple's stock value is not a 1-for-1 for what the accounting books say the company is worth. There's called book value, and then there's market value for a company. Book value is the 1-for-1 on paper. This is our assets, the total worth of all of our assets, minus our liabilities and stockholder investments. So that's the book value. The market value is based significantly on speculation, and not in a bad way. Like, we believe the future potential of this business is worth X. We believe in future earnings for this company will come in, and that elevates the price of the stock. As a matter of fact, like Apple's stock in particular, the market value is like several times more than what the actual book value of the company is worth. So when people get concerned, and this is why stocks plunge, when investors no longer have that confidence, and it can change rather quickly, they then sell. And then you sell because you don't want to be the investor that's stuck with the stock and you haven't sold it. And so this panic sets in and people just go sell, and the stock market goes. This is why, what was it, GameStop? There was that was a bubble. Like, it was artificially inflated.
It's going to the moon. I don't know how many times I hear that.
All the investors, they buy. And when you buy, when everybody's trying to buy your stock, i.e. the supply is stock supplies on any given company are not fixed per se, but for the sake of the explanation here, they're fixed. They can change, but they don't change on a dime. But the demand, i.e. everybody's trying to buy the stock, the price goes way the freak up. And then when it sells, all of a sudden that demand just plunges and the price goes way down. And this is in a nutshell what happened.
Look at any tech. If you want an example, just recently that we can equate ourselves to kind of what happened then at a large scale. Look at, we'll call it, look at Zoom. Everyone was like, oh, we're locked down. This is the new way to do business. Buying Zoom. Zoom stock went way up. Yep. Fast forward 18 months. Oh, okay. Well, hey, we're going to start opening back up. We're going to start going back to the office. The vaccine is here. COVID is moving on. And people started kind of returning to normal, and Zoom wasn't able to monetize their product as well. So people started just selling. And I don't know how much Zoom stock has tanked, but if you just looking at graphs, it has dramatically decreased in value for that very reason. Everyone was buying thinking this was going to be the way forward. And I see it go. I see the green line going up. I want to get in on it because now I'm worth more. Oh, it's going down. I better sell right now. It's almost like this test in psychology when you can see all the people that don't know much about investing, which is the vast majority of Americans, especially on Robinhood. Mm-hmm. It's like a game of psychology. It's actually like you want to buy when the stock's going down. You don't actually want to sell it. That's the wrong time to sell it because then you're losing money. But people can't. They just can't help themselves, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's a long way to say that this has happened before, and it's what caused the Great Depression. Back to you, Jay.
Right. Well, specifically, that's what happened for the stock market crash. So it's important to remember the stock market crash was only one thing in the long line of what happened in the Great Depression. And with that, the second key event that I wanted to talk about is 1 year later, So a whole year, and this is important when we start talking about the two different schools of thought for why the Great Depression happened, was in October of 1930, people began doing runs on the banks. These runs on the banks were primarily focused on small banks in more rural areas. When you deposit back in 1930, and to a certain extent still today, when one deposits money in the bank, let's just for simplicity's sake, I put $100 in the bank. That bank doesn't just sit on my $100. They then go lend that money out and only keep a very small fraction as a reserve. So what happens is, all these different people, they deposit money. The vast majority of that money then gets sent out elsewhere in the form of loans. And when, due to fear and bad economic conditions, you would then go, well, I'm getting my money out of the bank. If everybody were to do that, or even if a significant fraction of people were to do that, the bank runs out of money. Well, in order to get that money back, because they owe their depositors their money because it's theirs, they start calling in loans because they need that capital back so that they can give it to their investors. Well, in what happened in October of 1930, in these runs on the banks, unlike the stock market crash, was not a singular event. These runs on the banks really keep kind of going in waves until FDR is inaugurated in 1933. So we get almost 3 total years of just these waves of runs on the banks. And what happens is these banks were calling in the loans on the businesses, and the businesses couldn't always pay the money back immediately because they had the money invested in something that wasn't exactly liquid, i.e. translatable into cash quickly. And so somebody's going to go belly up, if not both, i.e. the people's going to lose their money. The bank is going to have to close their doors because they've lost all their money, or all three. And the business that has taken out the loan also just lost all their money. So we see here kind of this 3-year period of plunging economic conditions because banks are closing, small businesses who had loans with those banks are closing, and people are just running out of money. Well, when the businesses run out, or when the businesses start closing down, the jobs start going down. It's important to note when the stock market crash in 1929 occurred, employment did not spike to its high. So employment reached at the height of the Great Depression 25%. Sorry, unemployment. I'll say that again. Thank you, Colin. I'll say that again. So in 1929, when the stock market crashed, it wasn't like within a week unemployment jumped to 25%, which was what the high was during the Great Depression. It took time to get to that number. As a matter of fact, unemployment remained in the single digits, which is bad, by the way. Like unemployment right now is around 3-something%. But it didn't leave the single digits. I think it actually hung out in like 6-7% for the first 3 years from 1929 to 1933. But unemployment exploded during the Roosevelt administration because that's when like the runs on these banks had kind of run their course and everything shot down. This is important to note because, kind of jumping ahead here, but one school of thought blames the Great Depression on the stock market crash, and the other school of thought blames the Great Depression on the runs on the banks. So
interesting.
That's why I make this important note. Like when we're taught this in our high school history class, everything just kind of gets pushed together, and we don't exactly comprehend. Like, no, there was actually roughly a 4-year period between the stock market crash and the unemployment skyrocketing.
Yeah, to be honest, for me, for some reason, just mentally picturing it, it's almost like, oh, there's the crash. And then it's like the next day, nobody has money, nobody has a job, everything's
famine, dust bowl.
Exactly. Suddenly, like everything's kind of in this gray. But, just for some, an idea, like banks, I'd have to brush up on my monetary policy and some of the rules, but they only need about, I think, 10% of the amount of money that they loan out on hand. So if you go and ask for a loan of $100, they only need $10 to have. So if you think about it, they can get them. Now, they obviously will probably have more than that because that's incredibly dangerous. But even if it's a low number, if you have a lot of loans out and suddenly there's a run, you run out of money. And that's the point. You run out very quickly. We may think like, that's a bad thing. They shouldn't be loaning out money they don't have. Well, the idea behind, capitalism is using capital to fuel growth. And you can't grow a business. You can't grow the economy without money. I hate to break it to you. Like the goodwill of man will only go so far. Money is the fuel behind it, and you need capital behind that. And how do you raise capital? Well, most of the time you go get a loan. There's business loans. There's different lines of credit you can open. So it's a necessary evil that you have. Now, some of the regulations might have been loose. We're going to get into that, but I just want to make that point that it's not like this. It was this unusual thing. And even now we have the same kind of, hey, we don't need all that money on hand.
Right. No, it's this. So this is a great sidebar. So, and I'll try to make this brief. But again, the prevailing narrative is that what caused the Great Depression was that capitalism, imploded on its own demerits, right? What I would like our listeners to consider is that speculation is what rapidly increases the economy. Okay. In order for future economic growth, you need a bunch of capital. So just to kind of give an example here, Apple invests like 50 plus billion dollars in investments, and investments can be anything from like plant property and equipment. It could be research and development, like, hey, we're trying to make a better iPhone, better computers, better computer chips, improvements in the manufacturing process, etc. We're talking tens of billions of dollars annually on investment, just one company on investing in these kind of things. And that requires a bunch of money to exist. If we were on like a hard, like say we were back on the gold standard, right? Like there's not enough gold in the world to fuel those types of investments. So what one school of thought calls irresponsible, right? Like it's made up money. Like, yeah, it is. And it allows significant economic growth to occur. Mm-hmm. The emotional response of like, oh, this is irresponsible. We need to get this in a more comfortable thing. This is the same emotional impulse that trying to drive everything to central planning. Like increasing complexity for some reason drives certain people to want to control it. And the capitalist argument is, no, try to create an environment that's responsible for maximum growth. Not necessarily I'm going to control every single detail. That's riskier, but I think the benefits outweigh the risks. Sorry, that was a side tangent.
Well, this is a side tangent to your side tangent. You talked about the gold standard. There's not enough gold out there. That was part of the reason in 1971 we went off the gold standard. The idea was, well, we can fuel massive amounts of growth. And if you look at our GDP, you look at the innovation, you look at all these numbers since 1971, we've grown tremendously. Now, you can get into the argument about fiat currency and all that, but it's not like our money is actual truly paper. It is backed by the U.S. taxpayer and the U.S. economy's ability to pay that debt. Before it was gold, Like, this note is worth this amount of gold. Now it is worth like a piece of the American economy. That's one way to think of it. Like, the American economy is strong enough to pay this note. This is what is backing it. And as the economy grows, it's like, well, great. The dollar can fuel that. That's kind of the idea. That was the idea behind moving off the gold standard. We're going to get into the merits of that probably in a future. And when we get to the 70s and all, we'll get there. I just want to put that as a sidebar to your sidebar. So back to the two prevailing theories.
So the two main schools of thought come from two books. The first one, so John Maynard Keynes was a British economist that wrote a book called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money in 1936. Keynes, just for awareness here, Keynes is by far the dominant capitalist economic thinker today. Everyone's a little Keynesian, even if they don't agree with what's going on. Keynes' main argument, just in general, not necessarily on the Great Depression, in general, is that capitalism needs government intervention in order to stabilize the economy. So this unchecked capitalism, of which he uses the Great Depression as the primary example, but unchecked capitalism produces undesirable boom and bust cycles, i.e., yeah, you'll get a whole bunch of growth, but then you're going to get events like the Great Depression if the government doesn't step in to regulate it. The reason why I say everyone's a little Keynesian now is because by and large, and there's some exceptions, the 80s were a big exception of this, but by and large, regardless of political party affiliation, most American administrations and Congress have been basically Keynesian, i.e., when economic crises occur, they don't look to the private sector and competition to fix the issue. Everyone just kinds of turns to government and says, "Government, fix it." This wasn't the case prior to John Maynard Keynes and the General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. All right. His explanation for why the Great Depression is essentially when there is a massive drop in what he calls capital investment, i.e., people investing in the stock market. That's probably the main way that capital investment occurs. When there's a significant drop in capital investment that rapidly decreases demand. And I'm simplifying things here, but that rapidly decreases demand, i.e., stock market crashes, people get scared, people hang on to their money, and they try to save. And when people save their money, they're not going out and buying things. And that decreases demand, and that just is a significant depression on the economy. His conclusion, i.e., hey, the stock market crash caused the resulting Great Depression. His conclusion, so his main lesson learned that he draws from this, is that the Great Depression could have been avoided if the government would have spent money and lower taxes. So Hoover actually increased taxes because there was this lowering of everybody lost money to include the government. Hoover's like, well, we need to function, so let's raise taxes. And that just had a horrible effect.
He also increased tariffs.
Right. And you know who else increased tariffs? FDR, a Democrat, traditionally the anti-tariff party, but we digress. We'll get to that here in a second. Anyway, everybody kind of agrees with Keynes on the taxes piece, that taxes should have been lowered. So not going to go too far into that. But he basically said, hey, the government should have spent more money as a way to counterbalance the drop in private investment. So when private investment goes down, if the government spends and pumps money into the economy, that keeps demand at the appropriate level. And that would have it wouldn't have like made the Great Depression transparent, like it still would have been a fairly negative economic time, but unemployment wouldn't have reached 25%. Banks, I didn't mention this earlier, but roughly half of all banks in the United States closed. There was something like 25,000 banks prior to the Great Depression. We got down to 12,000 banks in the middle of it. Like, he thinks that if the government would have just spent more money and pumped money into the economy, that would have kept demand at a decent level, and the Great Depression wouldn't have been as bad.
I kind of, in a way, tend to agree with him, especially about the lower taxes. But it goes back to it was 1932 when FDR was elected, and everybody looks at FDR as the president with the New Deal. He acts like the National Recovery Act, but that was 4 years after the crash, and then it was still another couple years before a lot of these congressional and New Deal, the National Recovery Act, until these acts were actually passed. So that money didn't even hit the U.S. If you really think about it, that money didn't even take effect for years after this. So we talk about, well, it's not going to be this overnight. Well, the government just sent us a stimulus check. If they send you a check of money, then you're going to get a quick pump in the economy. But that's not exactly how they did things. Their idea of investment was like creating the Tennessee Valley Authority, where they created jobs and investment with like the different dams and hydroelectric power. That was one of their sources of investment, but that was still going to take quite a bit of time to counteract the rise in unemployment. And now that those people were employed, them spending their wages on consumer goods, because a lot of them were probably paying off debts or taking that money and immediately taking it, to put under the proverbial mattress, because they were still very uncertain. So this government intervention, at the time, was still going to take months or years to stimulate a recovery.
Right. Now, it's important to note how things, and this is what I love about the Loins of History. It's important to note how things have changed and how things have stayed the same. And this is just an anecdote, because we're going to save some key takeaways here towards the end. But Keynes' whole idea was the government needs to pump more money in the economy to stabilize the economy. Remember, this was prior to us coming off the gold standard in the 70s. So this idea of government pumping more money in the economy was not money printer go brr at this point in time, because this is
fantastic reference.
We were still on a standard, right? Keynes did not have in his head money printer go brr, right? Fast forward to COVID times, Keynes' theory of money, or the government has to pump more money in the economy, we now have, let's just print trillions of dollars. And so it's like we have Keynes, but we've also diverged from Keynes a lot, since he wrote this book in 1936. All right, real quick. So the other prevailing narrative for why the Great Depression happened comes from a book called A Monetary History of the United States, 1867 to 1960. This book was written by Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz in 1963. So we've got almost a 30-year period before anybody really challenged Keynes' explanation for the Great Depression. Now, Friedman and Schwartz basically argue that the Great Depression, again, not the stock market crash, but just the Great Depression on the whole, was caused by a drastic decrease in the money supply, i.e. deflation. So, in contrast to Keynes, they didn't think it was the stock market, but rather the unchecked runs on the banks that occurred from October of 1930 and in waves until FDR, when he was elected, he instituted a 10-day bank holiday. His speech, where he gave the phrase, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," right, comes from his announcement of the 10-day bank holiday, where it was like, y'all, chill. We're going to just chill for a couple weeks, right? And during this 10-day bank holiday, banks were allowed to refuse depositors, i.e. people who had put money in the banks, they were allowed to refuse them, like, hey, I want my $100 back. And they could say no. And it was just to try to like get everybody to chill the freak out. So Friedman and Schwartz basically say, hey, the Great Depression was actually really bad because the Federal Reserve didn't do anything from 1930 to 1933. So just a little context here on the Federal Reserve was the Federal Reserve, as we know it today, is only 14 years old at this point. We had the National Bank, we had the Second Bank of the United States, and then it had been like 70, maybe 80 years. I'm a little unsure there, but where the country didn't have a central bank. So the Federal Reserve was only 14 years old at this point in time. And its main function was to be, quote, a lender of last resort, i.e., what would happen was if these banks or businesses needed money, the primary lender would be bigger private banks. So like New York was a hub of just large banks. And they, you could think of them as almost too big to fail. They were the ones that would back up. So there had been a similar run on the banks situation, I believe, in 1907. And what happened, and what Friedman and Schwartz argue, was that when that run on the banks occurred, the large private banks just gave loans to the smaller banks and propped them up and kept them running. But when the stock market crash of 1929 happened and the runs on the banks happened a year later, people expected the Federal Reserve to be the lender. So the big banks didn't do anything, but then the Federal Reserve didn't do anything either. So these small banks were kind of left high and dry, and that's why they all closed. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say it. The Federal Reserve, I think it's kind of important. They had been acting in the 1920s by increasing this money supply by some like 67%. So they just had been pumping money into the economy. There's this massive surge in money. And then the Federal Reserve kind of was basically like, all right, we need to pump the brakes. This is getting highly speculative. So in a way, they caused it by raising interest rates, making it hard for you to get more money. Like think of it, mentioned before, the cost as rates go up, that's the cost of getting money, which also induced a panic. And then, as the money supply starts going down because the raising of rates starts working, like you said, the money supply continues going down. People are trying to pull money out. And it wasn't until when the March of 1933 that they had the bank holiday, you could see the money supply. It worked. For Friedman would probably be happy with that government intervention because the money supply started going up after that bank holiday. It's like that was almost like the low point in money supply, and then the money supply started going up.
Right. So because people were doing all these runs on the banks, they were taking money out of the economy. They were putting it under their mattress, so to speak. And that is what caused the decline. Businesses weren't able to continue to function because people were scared. Now, so Friedman and Schwartz's main conclusion, so that they draw from why the Great Depression occurred, is that the federal government actually, like, we should not rely on the government to save us. Rather, we need to allow the free hand, the invisible hand of the market to correct itself. Now, the main criticism, and I'll address it real quick, because at face value, it seems really obvious. So guys like Paul Krugman, who is, he's in like the mid 2000s, I think 2007, basically called Milton Friedman intellectually dishonest, because it's like, wait a minute, you're saying the Great Depression occurred because the Federal Reserve didn't do its job? Like, that means the way to have fixed that problem was to have a Federal Reserve that could have prevented the Great Depression, etc. And he was like, Milton Friedman's only coming up with this because his school of thought for economics is less government intervention, more of a free market capitalist type deal. By the way, Milton Friedman is probably the key economist behind what's called the Chicago School of Economics. And like Chicago school, generally speaking, is very like free market capitalist type deal, less government intervention. So guys like Paul Krugman were basically saying like, you're committed to this idea of free market capitalism. Therefore, you correctly diagnosed the issue, but your solution is actually the exact obvious of what is blatantly obvious, i.e. the government should have been more involved. So, however, that is missing Friedman and Schwartz's point in the book. The reason why they say the Great Depression occurred because the Federal Reserve failed to do its job is based on the idea of a counterfactual idea that if the Federal Reserve didn't exist, what would have happened, hence the counterfactual, what would have happened is that the market would have corrected itself in the same way that it had prior to the Federal Reserve existing, i.e., the larger private banks would have given beneficial loans to the smaller banks. In this, 3 to 4 year period of runs on the banks, either wouldn't have happened or it wouldn't have been nearly severe because these larger banks would have been able to give out these loans. Because again, it's important to remember the runs on the banks weren't primarily occurring on these big banks in New York. They were occurring on these tiny local banks out in the middle of Georgia, out in the middle of Oklahoma, right?
Right.
So Friedman and Schwartz's explanation here is based on if the Federal Reserve didn't exist, the Great Depression wouldn't have happened. It's not that the Federal Reserve caused it, rather it was their inaction that caused it. But because people expected them to do something, everything went south.
Interesting.
Yeah. Of note, and this is the last thing I'll kind of say, is that, well, it's always dangerous to say that there's any kind of consensus, right? Like the science is settled. Like I hate that phrase, right? So I don't want to say it here. And of course, economists still debate these things quite a bit. And if you get 100 economists in a room today, you're going to get 100 different opinions. However, Friedman and Schwartz have received quite a bit of validation, even from Keynesian economists, so much so that I'm blanking on the gentleman who said it, but I want to say he was either the chair of the Federal Reserve or he held a high position on the Federal Reserve Board. When Milton Friedman died, at his eulogy, this guy was like,
Bernanke?
"Hey, man, that's it. That's who it was. Ben Bernanke.
Yep.
Ben
From
Bernanke,
Dillon, South Carolina.
I'll be John Brown. I didn't know that. So at Milton Friedman's eulogy, he basically stood up and was like, "Friedman, you were right. We were wrong, and we're going to make sure that this never happens again." So like some high level economic thinkers have kind of been like, "We think you're right here."
Well, it's interesting that you bring up Ben Bernanke because he was chairman of the Federal Reserve around the time of the Great Recession. And I feel like the Great Recession and some of the immediate actions like the TARP Act and some of these others were done. Oh, we can't let the big banks fail. That'll cause this massive failure in this cascading effect. We need to, it was already a cascading effect, started with the housing industry, but we need to stop the cascade. That's what the government needs to do. So that's why I think their thought process was, okay, this is where we can get the government involved, and this is the least we have to do that'll have the most effect. Whether it was right or wrong, I tend to think they made a couple bad decisions in that recovery, but I think that Ben Bernanke and some of these other economists and these decision makers around in the Great Recession were like, well, let's think about this. This is what happened in the Great Depression. All of the interventionist acts of Hoover were the opposite of what needed to happen because he only made it way worse. And maybe we don't need to do what FDR did because, you could also argue that FDR was really not the reason behind the recovery. It was really World War II and really getting everybody back to work in mass production. That can be the argument that because that's when we came out of the Great Depression. So just tying it into today, I think that's kind of what some of the ideas behind these economists were. It was like, well, maybe we can't not intervene at all because then you get this wildly speculative economy of the 1920s where there's too much money and it's too easy to get and people are just throwing it around willy-nilly, and that can be dangerous. But we also can't just have the government come in and by its own ineptitude cripple the economy.
Right. Yeah. So kind of bringing this into some key takeaways for today. And we've been doing this history on the history of capitalism and socialism, trying to tie it into our larger walkthrough of this history here. Capitalism. So Keynes won in the beginning. Basically, from the 30s to the 70s, Keynes' explanation for the Great Depression was dominant, at least amongst economists, right? What that did to capitalist policy was we get a shift now. If we remember, prior to the Great Depression, Republicans were the party of government. They wanted high tariffs, they wanted lower taxes, and they wanted government spending on projects to increase to benefit the economy, right? Democrats were the ones of like, we don't want high tariffs, we don't want government spending. So in a sense, the laissez-faire capitalists were Democrats, and Republicans were more pro-government interventions. Once Keynes arrives, and FDR, who is a Democrat, by the way, all of a sudden FDR goes in 19. So the New Deal started as soon as he got elected or was inaugurated in 1933. The Democrats are now the party of Keynesian economics and go, oh shoot, now the government's got to do everything to get involved in the economy to fix everything, and all of a sudden Republicans go, wait a minute.
A massive switch.
And there's a switch. Oh, by the way, it doesn't have anything to do with racism. Go figure. And it has everything to do with economic factors of, remember, prior to FDR, Republicans were dominant, at least in presidential administrations. But once FDR arrives, Democrats begin to dominate less dominantly, if that makes any sense, because obviously after Truman, Eisenhower was elected a Republican. But we're kind of living in the Democrat era of, it feels like, actually, no, never mind. I won't say that. But the point being is that the primary economic theory of Democrats now becomes pro-government intervention. And we kind of see, for the history thread of capitalism, we now, nobody really becomes a free market economist almost until the 80s, until the Reagan administration. And, Reagan was big on deregulation in this trickle-down economics thing, which we'll get there eventually.
Someday.
But just to, again, I think it's super interesting that, when you look at how capitalism has progressed here in the United States, there was a big switch there in terms of policy and the political parties during FDR, and there are immediate implications for today. And just to kind of talk very quickly about what happened in COVID, we kind of already touched on it then, but there was increased government spending in order to continue to try to prop the economy up into
Your
trillions
stimulus
upon
checks.
trillions of dollars.
25%
Yes.
increase in money supply in 1 year.
Trying to get money, capital, in the hands of businesses, individuals, trying to get people to spend money, right? And what happened, and what's going on right now, was that the government just kept pumping, kept putting money into the economy. And then people were like, hey guys, we should probably stop. The Fed was like, no. And there was another round of stimulus checks. Like, we got to keep going. And wait for it, the government actually has created. So this is opinion. I should try to differentiate between what's Jay's opinion and what's, the facts of history here. But it's a growing view here that our current economic situation was not caused by what happened in COVID. Rather, it was caused by our response to COVID. So inflation went through the roof because we kept pushing money we increased the money supply, and now the Fed is trying to fix the fix. The Fed is going, oh shoot, our fix to COVID was too aggressive. Now we got to fix the fix, and now interest rate, and now we are on the precipice of major deflation. It hasn't happened yet, but there's some serious indicators. The most current of which has been the dollar, the euro, and the British pound are basically equal right now, one for one. I don't know when the last time that happened, but that's insane. The pound and the euro have been as high as double the dollar. But what we're seeing in Europe right now and in Great Britain is that the value of their currency is plummeting. That is deflation. Now, the dollar, as of today, is still remaining strong. So we're not saying
relative to those other currencies, I would say.
Right. Yes, that's right. So, however, there's some huge fears right now. And again, fear is what partially caused the Great Depression here, and panic. There are some big time fears that the dollar's next. The euro and the pound have almost lost half their value in the last couple of years. And the dollar's next. Whether that happens remains to be seen. I'm not an economist, so I can't go into a full detailed explanation. It's just deflation. If you believe Friedman and Schwartz, deflation is what caused the Depression, not the stock market crash. We're in a very similar situation today where the stock market didn't crash, but there was kind of a crash, and then volatility, i.e. runs on the banks for years. Like, remember, unemployment did not get outside of the double digits until like 4 years after the stock market crash, and it reached 25%. COVID happened in 2020. It's 2022. That doesn't, we can still punt this thing in the stands here, and unemployment can still explode. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, just kind of wrapping it up, that you're right. It was a lot of times the response that exacerbates and extends the Depression. Hoover got a lot of criticism for the limited actions he did take, like the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act exacerbated it. We look back on his actions and the Fed's rapid attempts to control speculation as things that made what was already going to happen way worse and increase this fear and this volatility. So it's what's happening now. You're right. We're still yet to be seen. There's a lot of signs here. But you're right. A lot of the government response to COVID only exacerbated the financial predicament. And that's probably the lightest way I can put it, the predicament that we're in now. Jay, this was a fantastic episode. We covered obviously a lot, trying to tie what happened in the Great Depression, the causes behind it, and tie that into what's going on today, because I think there is a lot of panic or early onset panic and real worry about the economic situation. And there's a lot of parallels between not just the Great Recession of 2007, but also the Great Depression. But with that being said, Next week, we're going to talk about the recovery and coming out of the Depression, the World War II, Cold War era, and this continued conflict between the capitalist and socialist movements within the United States and how that evolved into something that we're a little more used to seeing, and how the conversation really shapes today and starts to take effect. So if you like what we're doing, give us a follow on social media. We're trying to grow our social media following. We post pretty much daily things that generally pertain to what's going on our podcast. Give us a like. That definitely helps the algorithm. 5 stars are always appreciated. So whether you're on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or Podcast Addict, love to get a rating from you. And any comments or feedback, please let us know. We like to interact with our audience as much as possible. Thank you for joining the Loins of History, and we'll see you next week.